Great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to see such a great turnout.
I know, I'm excited.
Excited to have you all here.
Give it one more minute and then I will get us started. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Zoom webinar on salary negotiations. As Anne-Marie just articulated in the chat, we will be opening the chat at 1 p.m. for questions. So that is the place to put your questions for our two panelists to address after their brief presentation. I'd like to start out by introducing our speakers today. Dr. Zoe Barsness serves as the MBA Program Director in the Milgard School of Business at UW Tacoma, and her research focuses on negotiation, particularly in the context of developments in communication technologies, organizational structures, and work arrangements. I have had the privilege of being in classes through the executive management program at Milgard with Dr. Barsness, and I think you're really going to be learning a lot and energized by her presentation today. Ann Kirker serves as the Director of Human Resources at Farallon Consulting in Seattle. In addition to her work in human resources, we're privileged to have Ann serve on the advisory board for the Center for Leadership and Social Responsibility in the Milgard School of Business. She brings years of experience in human resources and will share how that experience works in partnership with research around negotiations. What does it look like in the real world? So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Zoe Barsness and Ann Kirker, and we can begin our learning process.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I'd also like to highlight that Ann is one of our alumni as well, one of our MBA program alumni. So it's a treat to be back on a panel with her in this venue. So thank you for coming, and thank all of you who provided some feedback and data to us as you registered for the program, identifying some of the things that you're worried about or hopeful about when you are negotiating. In particular, the really sensitive type, approaching the very sensitive negotiation situation of looking to nail down a salary when you've received a job offer. So some of the things that spoke through your comments spoke to some of the typical anxieties that people have about approaching salary negotiations, very worried about appearing greedy or losing the job that's on the table if you push too hard. Maybe even not so worried about that, but giving the wrong impression in terms of anticipating, once I actually start the job and getting off on the wrong foot with the employer. And then the practical one is like, well, what if they say no? Then what do I do, right? And then on the flip side, you're also anxious and hopeful about what you might positively realize if you negotiate a better package for yourself. You can change the socioeconomic future and improve your family's well-being and security. On the economic front, you could actually impress your future employer and show that you have some of the skills and capacities that they were excited to hire you for in the first place. And then obviously demonstrate that you're able to bring and leverage those in service of the organization. So there's a dilemma. It's like, do I negotiate or not? And then the question is, how do I answer that? I want to be really emphatic that there is a significant cost to not negotiating your salary. So let's do a little scenario. Suppose at age 30, two equally qualified people, Chris and Mary, get job offers for $100,000 per year from the same company. Chris negotiates and gets a salary component increase to $107,600, while Mary accepts the offer at $100,000. Over the next years that they're working for the company, they each get 5% annual raises. So by age 65, what is the cost of that one-time decision not to negotiate? In other words, what is the value of that decision at the time of retirement at age 65? What would it mean Mary would have to do? How much longer would she have to work to secure and build up the same financial resources over that period of her working history? It's worth 8 years. She would not be retiring until she was 73 to achieve the same financial well-being as Chris, who negotiated that very first job offer. So it is very important to maximize your value to the employer at that time. And so at this point, I want to hand the baton over to Anne and she can speak a little bit to what is the world look like from the employer's perspective in entering these types of negotiations.
Thank you very much, though. And I definitely want to reiterate what you mentioned about the cost over the course of your career of negotiating, especially because there's so many benefits that are tied to your salary. A lot of employers offer bonus based on salary, 401k or 403b or other retirement plan contributions. So it's not just the annual amount of that salary. There's such a cumulative benefit. So negotiating every little bit really does have a long-term effect. So as an employer, having worked in a variety of industries, we do expect that people are likely to negotiate a bit. We expect that everyone has different types of needs, different interests, and as a result of that, some people will be negotiating for a higher salary, others may negotiate for other benefits or perks, such as extra vacation. And really, we're expecting this to be a dialogue where we work through something to get to a common ground on the other side of the offer.
Oh, great. And just in line with that, a few years ago, I was doing giving a workshop for Lean In, and there was an HR manager in the audience who spoke exactly to Anne's point about that she both expected and actually appreciated folks who came in and negotiated in a principled way. And we'll come back to Anne's point about all the different aspects of the employment package you want to think about. It's not just about the financial component. That is important to consider as you approach these types of situations. So I'm just going to put this as an anchor for reference for us as we work through, because, obviously we've made the case for can you and should you. Now the big question and the tricky part is how is it best approached? And I will emphasize that more than any other factor that's going to influence your ability to secure an improved outcome is the level of preparation that you invest. This is where negotiators often don't do enough, is they do a little bit and then they trust that in the flow of the moment they're going to be able to manage to the dynamic of the negotiation to achieve their goals and objectives in the moment. And you will be much better positioned to manage that process successfully if you've invested significant amount of time preparing, doing the research on Glassdoor, your career center, talking to friends who might already work for the employer, talking to other people in the same industry who have similar jobs, talking to folks who are at similar levels or of progression in their careers, even if they're not in the same industry, and kind of seeing what some of the issues they've encountered or creative ideas they've come up with when they last negotiated their employment package. Those are all really good ways to prepare for the negotiation and identify what you're going to ask, what your goals and objectives are going to be, and what perhaps some strategies and tactics are that you're going to adopt going in. I'll speak to the second point and then I'll let Anne talk about the knowing your value. So one of the most important things is going into any negotiation is having a criteria by which you're going to judge if I open the negotiation, they provide offer to me and I come back and I ask for something different in content or amplitude, how do I know when they counter with another offer whether or not it's time to say yes or it's time to keep working and seeing if there might be something else that they could do to craft a package that's even more appealing to me. And that is identifying a criteria against which to judge the merits of the package that's been put on the table. And the best way to do that is to know, what am I going to do? What is my life going to look like if I don't come to agreement with this employer? Am I going to stay in my current job? Is there another interview that I've got in process that might result in another job offer? Is there another job offer that's already on the table from another company that I'm not quite as excited about? So what is it I'm going to do if I don't come to agreement with this employer? And that gives me a criteria, benchmark, against which I can judge the merits of any proposal that this employer that I'm talking with and I are crafting together during the course of the negotiation. So that's a really important thing to do in advance of the negotiation. Anne?
And I will emphasize too, I took those negotiations class over a decade ago, and I still use the phrase BATNA multiple times a month because it's such a powerful tool to have in your toolkit about what will I do if this doesn't work out? And it frees you up from that fear. So I cannot emphasize that enough. As far as knowing your value, as Zoe said, the preparation is so important. If you go into an interview or a negotiation process and you don't know what this role should pay, what the other perks and benefits could be, you're selling yourself short. And so that research, there's so much information available online now. You can ask peers and other people in the industry what they think a role like this should pay. You're not asking what they make, but you're asking what they think this should pay, which is a lot more comfortable for people. I also recommend that people, when you think about the preparation, first of all, practice having that conversation with somebody about the points you're asking for, and then write them down so that when you're either on the phone or over a Zoom or Teams meeting with this person you're negotiating with, you already have this written down so that in the heat of the moment of thinking about how much you would love this job, you don't sell yourself short. You've already got a number or other factors written down so that you can refer back to them. And then as far as your current salary, in a variety of states, I think we're up to 21 right now, it's actually not legal for employers to ask what your current salary is. Some employers don't know that, and in some states it is still legal. But regardless, if somebody says to you, what are you making now? The answer can just be, for a role like this, my expectations are. You don't have to say exactly what you're asking for. Now, some recruiters may try to push you on that, but generally speaking, telling them what you're expecting from that role is always the right answer.
And that's really important too, because you do not want to get, weighed down by, maybe what your current salary is because you took that job right out of your graduate degree or your undergraduate program, and you were not maybe in a position to negotiate a more attractive package than you did, or because of the level of your experience and opportunities at that time, you came in at the low end of the salary range for that position in that organization. But since then, you've built out your range of competencies and the capital that you bring to the table and is attractive to the employer, which is why they made this offer to you in the first place. It's really, really important to remember that they made you an offer. You've succeeded through a very long and, quite honestly, from the employer's perspective, costly process of recruiting and investing in selecting the candidate that they are most excited about, and that happens to be you. And it's really, really important that you remember that, because that's part of your value. And they've recognized that, and they've made you an offer. They want you to come on board, and they have probably offered you a package anticipating you will negotiate. So they've created some room on their side to go through some back and forth with you in crafting a package that works for you and works for them as well. So it's really critical in that moment. We're like, oh my gosh, they might take that back. I remember my job first out of college. That was my worry when I went and asked for more money, and I was so worried they were going to take that job offer back. But the reality is they want you to come, and that this is part of a conversation where they want you to come on board and be happy and equally enthusiastic about starting to work for the company. So a couple of ideas. Anne highlighted before that there's a lot more to the job package than just the salary. And so here are some ideas capturing, Anne gave a wonderful little preview of some of these things, but it's also important to realize that you are not just negotiating kind of the economic package, but you are negotiating the terms or the conditions upon which you are going to be successful in the role or not. And so it's critical to think about, hey, this is not just about what I'm going to get paid or what my benefits are. Those are all very important. But it's about what's the scope of my responsibility going to be? What am I going to be expected to do, and where and how am I going to be expected to perform? Are they providing me the access to the right decision makers and the resources that I need to be successful given those performance expectations that we've talked about and established as appropriate for me coming into that role? And then thinking longer term, where do I want to go with my career? Are there developmental opportunities? Are there key job assignments that might be helpful or useful to me down the road in terms of continuing to advance in the career? Those are all appropriate things to talk about. You may not nail them down exactly, but recognizing and sharing with them that you are interested in a long-term career trajectory and what that looks like, and that you're developing some shared expectations and perhaps some commitments on the part of the employer to make a investment in you that's going to allow you to be successful in the role they're hiring you for and position you to continue to grow and advance in your career. So that's really important to think about in the context of the negotiation as well. Anything you wanted to add there, Anne?
I think that's a great summary. And also the fact that what's important to you might be different than what's important to other people. So if there's something that really, there's that certification you've always wanted to get, have that conversation now. Now's the chance to get that ironed out. That way you don't have to come back and renegotiate for it. Right now it's just part of the package. Or if you're looking for that hybrid remote work schedule that some people doesn't matter to, but it matters to you, this is the time to iron all that out. And you do have some leverage right now because, as Zoe said earlier, they want you to come on board. They've been going through this lengthy interview process and you're the candidate. So this is a chance to iron these items out.
All right. Well, I think we've covered most of what we wanted to bring up front and share with you. Is there anything else you would like to highlight, Anne, before we open things up for questions?
You know, I think it would be good if you could, Zoe, to talk a little about your research about the principled and assertive style.
So, yes. So one of the interesting areas where I'm currently researching is there has been a good bit of research over the last 20 years on the role of gender in negotiation, and I'm sure many here are familiar with the notion that women don't ask. Women are less likely to initiate negotiations than men are. In a sense, it's an activity. The word itself connotes an activity that isn't one that is part of kind of the natural socialization for women, generally speaking, than for men. That said, women who do negotiate, there are not systematic differences in terms of gender once people actually initiate negotiations. So part of what's driving those differences, getting back to the story of Mary and Chris, is you're seeing differences in starting salaries because women are less likely to take the opportunity to negotiate when they get that job offer than if they do negotiate, they're less successful at securing a better outcome for themselves. So that's an important thing to remember. But don't self-sabotage by not taking advantage of the opportunity to negotiate. And the more you negotiate, the more comfortable you will get doing it, and the more readily you'll see opportunities to do it in ways that are constructive. So that's important. And then the other piece is, a lot of the conventional wisdom that's developed over the last 10 years or so is that, if women negotiate, they have to worry about backlash, either social or professional backlash, that they're more likely to be perceived as being pushy or greedy than if a man in a similar situation moves ahead and initiates a negotiation and makes an ask. And some of the work that I've been doing recently with a group of colleagues, we've been investigating this. A lot of that traditional research that was done, the type of asks that they were looking at were actually quite aggressive, as opposed to what I would call is principled assertion, which is firmly and graciously asserting your underlying interests, making clear what's important to you, having done your homework so you can highlight the value that you bring to the organization to show what it is that you're able and willing and ready to contribute to the organization that is deserving of fair compensation. And doing that in a principled way, our recent research shows that there is not the backlash that conventional wisdom tells women to be worried about in particular, and more broadly, people in general to be worried about. So there is a sweet spot where asking and asserting and being clear about your underlying interests, what's important to you, but then being flexible about how they are met is really effective and helps build the relationship in a constructive way going forwards. And so an example of that might be, maybe you really want and need 3 weeks of vacation a year because spending that time with your family is really important. That's a positional ask. I need 3 weeks of vacation. And the underlying interest is I want to spend time with my family. That's what's most important to me. And the employer may be a startup company. They don't have a lot of cash. They have a small group of employees, and they're only in a position to give 2 weeks of paid vacation. So they're responding, sorry, 2 weeks of paid vacation. I had a student years ago that he and I worked together to craft the request like, hey, what if you give me 3 weeks of vacation, but one of those weeks is unpaid? I'm really concerned about spending time with my family. So that's an example where you firmly defend your underlying interests, the why you're asking for something, but you're flexible and creative about how those underlying interests are met. And that's part of being principally assertive too.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that amazing overview of negotiations and the role of gender in negotiations. One of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat is really about how do negotiations look in different sectors? So in particular, in the nonprofit sector and public employees sectors, where often folks will hear, we just don't have the resources to offer you more money, or this is what we have to offer you, take it or leave it. How would you recommend folks kind of engage with negotiation in those different sectors?
Well, do you mind if I jump in, Zoe?
Yeah, please. You're a direct relevant experience.
I think this goes back to the preparation point, which is to know who you're negotiating with and what they can offer. So, for example, in the public sector, they truly may be limited to this is the range for this type of role, and there's nothing they can do. And the benefits might be very strictly controlled by a union or by a negotiated agreement. And in that case, what they can offer you is career development, right? So you could ask questions about what will it take for me to go to the next step? Do I have to attain a different certification or a different degree? And is there support for that? Whether they can or not will depend greatly on the role, on the organization you're negotiating with. But bear in mind that there probably are some things they truly can't, but there are some things they can, and just know what those are. And the same thing is true for nonprofits. And it's true. For nonprofits, certainly salary can be a challenge. But to Zoe's point, a nonprofit might be able to give you more time off, or flexibility of a work schedule, or flexibility of where you're working from. And so just knowing what that organization can offer you is important. I also think it's important to know that going in, you're not going to get an organization, most likely, that can give you everything. The high salary and the high bonus and all the time off and the flexible work, just due to the constraints of operating in the world. And so knowing that and knowing what you can push on and what you can't and being prepared to push on those items will really help you have a higher level of confidence.
And I'd just like to follow up on Anne's advice is so valuable and on point, but I back up and kind of give a little bit higher. So what does that mean? We often think of the negotiation as a persuasive activity. I'm going in and I'm trying to sell them on what I want and try to convince them to say yes. To Anne's point, especially in contexts where you're working with an employer that may have a lot of constraints, you should anticipate that the conversation with the employer is largely about getting information and providing information. It's about information exchange so that you can get insight into what some of those constraints might be for the employer and where they have flexibility. When I first got my first academic job offer, my dissertation advisor, a very preeminent negotiations researcher in the world, she gave me such wonderful advice. She said, your first conversation about this package, it's nothing about just gathering information and asking questions and understanding better what the actual package is all about and understanding where there might be some flexibility on the part of the employer to do something different and get an appreciation of where they may have constraints that they cannot operate. That took so much pressure off me, and I had this wonderful discussion with the hiring department chair, and I got a lot of ideas about where I could go back to ask for some changes in the job offer in terms of what my teaching assignments were going to be, places where they actually could do things that would align with making me more successful as a newly minted PhD faculty member, which I wouldn't have thought of had I not had the conversation that I was just focused on getting information and understanding better what was offered, and took the pressure off about, I have to make a counteroffer in this conversation. So look to share and get information to understand better what the world looks like from their perspective, so that when you do put a proposal on the table, it will be more appealing to them because you're going to position it in such a way that it resonates with what you understand their wants and needs are.
Thank you so much for that, Zoe, because I think it really, again, points to the importance of preparation going into the negotiation process. I'm going to ask you, Zoe, if you can stop sharing your screen, if you don't mind, since we're done with slides. And there's some questions that I'm seeing in the chat around what are the differences between what differences are there in the negotiation process between when you're applying for and have been offered a new job versus when you're going through a performance review process? Do you approach that negotiation process differently? And if so, how?
I think I would say that the biggest difference is in the negotiation for a new job. You're making the promise about what you're going to do. In the performance review process, you can point back to the accomplishments of what you have done. And this is one place where it's so important that throughout that time period, you've been keeping track because you're busy, right? We're all busy. And so you forget these things you do that are seemingly small or sometimes big. And the review cycle comes around and you just say, oh, I feel like I've done a great job. Your employer needs tangible things. I negotiated this contract. I saved this $2,000 or $20,000. I handled this process improvement and change management way better than anybody ever has. Whatever your tangibles are, give them to your employer so that they're armed with that information to help you make the argument for what you should be getting in your performance review. I think those are the high level things I think of. Zoe, what would you say?
Yes, to that point, for certain. And then thinking back to this notion of BATNA, which, is an acronym for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Again, what's going to happen if you don't come to an agreement? Well, in this situation, saying I'm going to be in the same job, and then I might be in a position where I'm still dissatisfied and I'm going to look. But to Anne's point, keeping track of those successes and accomplishments, one, it's really satisfying. It's important from the standpoint of staying motivated and feeling a sense of progress and success, separate from making a case for a higher salary, whatever down the road. It's just really important for your emotional, psychological well-being and your ability to be effective in the workforce and take satisfaction from the purpose with which you approach what you're doing. And so it's important for that perspective. And then it's important in terms of making a compelling case that indicates, hey, I know my value, and here's the value that I'm bringing to the organization. And it's important to think about framing what you've done in ways that are showing that you're sensitive to what your managers and those who are in a position to give you the raise or the new job assignment that meets their needs. It's not enough for me to say, hey, I've done a great job, I did all these things. I need to be able to frame it in a way as, how did I create value that's recognizable and valued by the person I'm working for and the organization that I'm working for, and shows that I can move into a position to continue to add value in ways that support them in what they need to accomplish as a manager or a unit head. So it's not just about saying, hey, what I think was valuable. It's important to keep track of that. But you really need to think about, again, what does the world look like from their perspective? And how can I share all the wonderful things I've done in a way that highlights for them, here's how I delivered on things you care about and you have needs. That's really important. And then keeping track of all that, if you're not successful, hey, that's all going to come in handy if you end up looking for a job elsewhere because you don't see the avenues of opportunity continuing to open up at the organization you're at.
I think that's such an important point, Zoe. And I would also add, it's good too in your performance review process to make sure your manager knows that you're happy and what you like about the organization, right? So in the job offer stage, you're saying, oh, I'm really excited about this opportunity. I'd love to come work with you. But in your review, you don't want to go into it with your manager thinking that you're really unhappy, so you're just going to ask for more money. No, I love it here. I love the work I'm doing. Here's the contributions I've made. And being prepared with both those pieces, it makes it a much easier conversation for you and also for your manager, because everyone wants to work with people who are happy doing their jobs.
Yeah, and here's where I see some opportunity to make additional contributions. I'd love to have the opportunity to make contributions in these areas. Do you see an opportunity for me there? What would I need to do in order to navigate the bridge if I'm not quite ready for that opportunity yet? All important things to know. And then the other thing that came to mind as Anne was talking, and I referenced my first job out of college, and I had an offer from a consulting firm. It was my only offer. I actually had more information than the employer. I was the first undergraduate they had hired into this new consulting group. And I, of course, had a lot of friends from college that were getting offers at many other the consulting firms this group wanted to compete against in the marketplace. And so their offer came in, and it was significantly lower than what the starting salaries were that my friends were getting from other firms. I was sweating bullets, but I went and I said, look, I am so excited about this offer. I'm seriously considering taking it. Here's my one hesitation. Is the salary seems low. I provided the information relative to my peers who are getting offers from these firms. Is there anything you might be able to do to improve the salary? So I didn't say I'm not going to take it. I told them I was really excited. And I used kind of the reciprocity norm. I'm excited. I want to work for you. Here's some reference points that are relevant for you in terms of who you think of as your competitors. Of course, I didn't know any of this. I just dumb luck that at the time that I was able to land on this. But I got a $10,000 bump in pay, which at that time was huge, right? And would be really nice today too. But yeah, if I hadn't asked, what's the worst thing they can say? No.
Right.
But if you don't ask, they definitely can't say yes.
I appreciate Zoe you bringing up that word reciprocity. Besides the fact that it's one of my favorite words, it really points out that the negotiation process is a process and that both parties are seeking to benefit from that process. There's a question in the chat about kind of what does it look like in action to do this, right? So your phone rings and you get a job offer. Do you ask for 24 to 48 hours to consider the offer and then come back with a counteroffer? Do you engage in that process kind of immediately on that phone call? What is it? How much more can you ask for realistically, depending on the sector? Is there a sweet spot? Ask for 10% more, 20% more if it's a salary negotiation. What are your thoughts on the nitty gritty details of my phone rings with a job offer? What do I do next?
Zoe, you teach a whole class on this, so I think that.
Oh yeah. So I'll take the typical organizational behavior professor response, or management professor. Well, it depends, and it does depend. And I'm not saying that just to defer. So the context is, if I got the job offer, you will have some sense about kind of what the employer. Sometimes you will, I've been in the unfortunate situation myself where I've had an exploding job offer. That was the worst, right? Where I got a job offer, and it was with a university in Canada, so there were a lot of things to think through, as just what that meant in terms of a whole host of things related to employment. And I was given, I think it was less than a week. I was given a weekend to provide an answer. And at the end of the day, I also took that as a sign about, is this a culture I want to go work in? If given the complexity of this decision process, and that I'm looking at moving internationally, I don't have enough time to actually investigate even things like the tax implications over the course of a weekend. And so in the end, I did not have a next offer, but I turned that offer down because I could not do my due diligence to feel comfortable about saying yes. And and I had a job I still liked and enjoyed, with colleagues I enjoyed. So that status quo was a good one. So some of it depends on, what is your situation? What's the time frame? General advice, I would probably say, I'm really, really excited. I would ask questions in the moment. I would ask them if they have time, if I've got specific questions in the moment based on what they've shared with me, to get a little bit of additional information, just to have a better understanding of the specifics of the job, especially relative to things I've already thought hard about in terms of my wants and needs. And I would say, hey, I am so excited. Let me get, if it's okay with you, I'd love to think about this. I may have some additional follow-on questions. Would you be open to having a conversation about those? What might be a good time frame? And then, and I promise I will get back to you within X. So that could be a response that you do. Generally speaking, asking questions, getting more information so that you get some insight is a good. Is there a rule of thumb? Always ask for 10% more money? No, that's going to be a function of the industry. You may have, during the course of the interview process, been given some ranges by the firm about what their typical ranges are for this position, and then you will be able to assess what the offer is relative to the range that they shared with you. They may already be giving you something at the high end of the range. And then you may have done additional research about, well, what if they are an employer that's at the 60th percentile, given these types of positions relative to competitors, versus someone who is paying at the 80th or 90th percentile. So it's just important to think about, what's the context. There are no formulaic things. It's more important to think about, understanding the nature of the position, where, and most importantly, not just about salary, but what is the opportunity to grow and develop new skills in the position. And then getting the research to assess, where is this offer falling relative to the possible range, to get a sense of what is and isn't negotiable. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And I liked very much what you said too about the culture of the organization and the way they're negotiating with you, because that is pretty telling, right? It tells you how they operate and what style they use. The one thing I would say is, if you might luck out if you get an offer that every single thing about it matches except for one piece. And this did happen to me once, where my list and everything was checked off except salary. They were a little lower than I wanted on salary. And in that case, I was fortunate enough that I was able to put the ball back in their court. And I said, this sounds great, so excited, except I was really hoping we could get to X on salary. And then now they have to go back and talk about it. And when they came back to me and they had met my request, I accepted on the spot. So it really does depend on what those additional pieces are. But I agree completely. Though I've never been upset with somebody for saying, I appreciate the offer. I want to ask a couple more questions because I really want this to be a good fit for you and for me. Great. I'm all in for that.
At that point, again, they're invested. And then I think, to follow up on Anna's point, she accepted. When they met her where she wanted to be, she accepted. And I do have friends and colleagues who've been in the hiring manager spot, and they have gone through and kind of had the type of lovely, constructive, productive conversation Anne described, and then they put an offer on the table based on what they think they understood, they heard, and what was needed, and then the nibble. Oh, wait, maybe they can do more. And so you need to be thoughtful, ask for what you want and need, help communicate why it's valuable, why you think you're bringing value to the table, and then be willing to just say, hey, I accomplished what I set out to do, and let them enjoy the savoring of the moment of success as much as you do, as opposed to kind of deflating their balloon by asking for more than what you initially asked for at that moment, if they've met you where you've asked.
I'm so glad you said that, though, because I think that goes back to what you were talking about with the good faith, the principled negotiating. Mm-hmm. Because as someone in HR, when we've had the conversations, I think we're on the same page, and we keep meeting you and you keep asking for more, it's frustrating, right? Like, it makes me feel like you don't actually want the job. You weren't honest with me, or did something change and you're not telling me. And so just being upfront from the beginning so that everyone is on the same page. And that's not to say that you have to accept an offer just because they met you where you're at. But if you said this is the one thing that I need to get to, and they get there and you don't, that's rough. That does not set you up in a good light.
So, Anne, one thing you mentioned is that there are states in this country where it is not legal for an employer to ask the question, what is your current salary? And I'm not sure if Washington is one of those states, legality-wise, but our students may end up in many different states in their professional careers and journeys. How should somebody kind of address that question if it comes to them in a way that is principled, thoughtful, and still kind of allows them to enter into a good negotiation process?
Good question. And I should have looked this up before we had the call, because I actually don't know if Washington is, because from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, we've made the decision not to ask that question. Mm-hmm. So even if we could, we wouldn't. But it is something students or anyone should know before they have the conversation. Depending on, again, the organization you're negotiating with, I would personally assume positive intent, that the person asking doesn't know that they can't ask, especially if it's a smaller firm or a startup. This might be something they've always asked. And so I definitely wouldn't say, oh, you can't ask me that, right? That's just going to set things off on the wrong foot. So I would try as hard as possible to point it back to, oh, well, I'm looking for in a role like this one, or the role I'm in is really different. So, for example, I worked in travel for a while, and obviously travel has some really different benefits than other places. Right. And so when I went to negotiate my next role, I did say, I also have this. And so this is part of my total comp package here. I know it won't be here. And so I'm looking for something different here to account for that. So I would just try to keep refocusing on what it is you're looking for and why that's different than what you're doing now.
I mean, to Anne's point, the key thing you're doing is, and this is part of the preparation and the research process, is making sure that you're establishing, what is the terrain and the domain within which this salary negotiation, this job package negotiation is going to occur. So if I've been working in, nonprofit sector and now moving into the private sector, big difference in salaries, right? And if I'm being asked, well, what's my salary in the nonprofit sector, that's going to just be a terrible anchor on even if they don't intend it to be, psychologically, by my having said it to myself in a public setting, it will act as an anchor on what I'm willing to accept. And one of the interesting things about the research that we've been doing recently, and looking at, what happens when there's a big push in Europe and elsewhere about promoting pay transparency. And, so we've been doing different studies where we've been looking like, okay, if I'm the employer provides a range and I get a sense of, I'm comparable to people who are paid at the higher end of the range or at the lower end of the range. And what's really interesting is for men in our studies, they just ignore that. They're risk-taking. They just blow by that information and they shoot for the higher end. When the range is provided and folks are given information that says, based on your qualifications and comparables, you and you're at, equivalent at the higher end of the range, men and women both ask for similarly assertive salaries. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is when, women will gravitate towards that lower end, even though they're told they're comparable. So for women, it's really, really important that you look for aspirational, positive reference points that you can gravitate to and fix onto as why you both deserve and are justified in asking for more, and not get, we tend to be worried a lot more about should and whether or not we should ask for those things. And Anne's been giving you some really wonderful language that makes, I think, for women in particular, more comfortable about asking. I'm looking for as opposed to I want. That can be easier to say for many people than the more seeming selfish, like I want this. And then I think assuring that they understand this job is different and in a different sector, and so I would expect compensation here. If for some reason down the road for your historical records you need information about what my current salary is, should I end up working for you, I'd be happy to share that information at that time. But right now, what seems to be most relevant to me is this is the area that the job's in, and this is what I would expect to be paid given my qualifications and competencies, given these are what the standards or ranges are that I understand to be the case in this field.
And I appreciate both of you because you've addressed another question that I saw in the chat around where in the process do you start the negotiation process? Do you start during the interview? Do you start once you have an offer? We only have another minute or two left, but if each of you could say a couple of, before I wrap us up, if each of you could say a couple of words about kind of the best place and way to start planting those seeds, particularly if an employer says, this is the salary for the position, in such a way that it feels like there's no room to negotiate.
And when we were preparing for this, you had some great ideas about this and done some things that worked.
Oh, thank you. So I like to ask right up front as a recruiter on the employer side and also as the candidate. And again, to Zoe's earlier phrasing, to ask in a non-threatening way. It's not, what does this job pay? It's, I'd like to make sure we're in the same ballpark so we don't waste each other's time. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a very friendly way of just, and it's true, right? You're being clear, they're being clear. And I think that's really critical. And if the employer says, oh, the range is X to Y, you can ask, right? Oh, is there some wiggle room on that? Or, I'm looking at the total comp package. In order for me to accept this job, I would need a couple of other things. You can talk about those other things too, or you can, leave it open if you say, I was looking for something on the higher end of that, and see how they respond. They might come back and say, well, let's keep talking, and we can cross that bridge when we come to it.
Yeah. And then based on your research, if that's a range that's really pleasantly surprising, I would take that as information like, okay, as I go forward in this process, I need to go do some additional research because I clearly have not found the right sources of information to understand what their world is like. And I may then end up being willing to go at the lower end of what they're willing to pay just because I'm not as familiar with what their perceived competitive hiring space is. If it's much lower than I thought, then I would start asking questions about, to me, that would be an indicator like, wait a second, maybe this job isn't what I thought this job was. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is not as good a fit for my portfolio of skills that I'm already bringing to the table or where I'm looking to continue to grow and develop further. And so that would be a signal to me to ask some more penetrating questions as the process unfolded about what the nature of the position is, what the scope of responsibilities are, what the developmental opportunities are, so that I'm really sure that I'm buying apples if I'm looking for apples and I'm not getting oranges. Right?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, and I hate to cut you off. It's just that silly class end time that we have come to. I just want to take a moment to thank both Zoe and Anne for their insights. I learned a lot today, and I hope our participants did as well. Anne Marie, I was going to ask you to go ahead and put the slides up real quickly. A couple of quick things for our audience today. We want to let you know that if you'd like to dive deeper into this topic and learn more about negotiations, we will be offering a full day workshop on Saturday, March 19th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the UW Tacoma campus. Our plan is for this to be held in person. Registration is still open, and if you scan this QR code or go to the CLSR website, you will indeed be able to find more information about registering. You can also absolutely contact Ellen Hermanson, who is taking the lead on the logistics for this event, and she can let you know about discount codes that are available not just for Milgard students, but for UW staff and faculty as well.